some other African countries. I don't know how we Africans sees ourselves. By the ways, I will give you a background to colonialism and its pendant effect on Africa and African resources. I'm really waiting to have our particular guest, at least one, and then we can go on with this. Which was happening in Niger, not just in Niger, you have Mali and you have Burkina Faso. All these countries have been taken over by the military and they are basically in defense of their own people. So just a few people, and then we continue with what we're about to talk about. Just in case you must know, this is the first live broadcast. I've been unable to sleep basically last night because I was concerned by what's going on in Niger and some other African countries that were colonized by France. The French people have actually exploited Africa to a very great detriment, and the African continent, as you might have it, have suffered greatly for this in so many ways. And I'm here to just give you a few pointers so you might understand what's happening across French Africa, or what you call the Francophone Africa. Well, we're waiting for some of our guests to come live and then watch this video. Basically, Africa has suffered a lot, and it's a period and a time of um, not just revolution, but it's a period and time for Africa to realize what the bipolar government has done to the world, not just Africa, but to all countries that were colonized. Some are basically left alone, and some others have been treated like an afterthought. Nigeria under the British, we know what they do. Like they always support just government that favors them. Like I said, if you are aware or if you are abreast with what's happening in Africa, you see the treatment that was meted on most African leaders, most African revolutionary leaders like Muammar Gaddafi and a lot of them, and the man in Zimbabwe too, was treated like an afterthought. And in most times, our people are so relaxed about such treatment. But be it as it may, today is the day I decided to talk about it, and with a major focus on the French Africa or the Francophone African nations. Those of you who were able to have been colonized by Britain might not might not feel the direct impact of what they're doing through their bipolar agreement. You often hear of the term NATO, you hear of United Nations and its permanent members, but you do not understand the full meaning and the full implication it has to your own country. All you know is they have always come for humanitarian services, and then you think it's okay. Why are there less humanitarian services in countries like Sweden, in Japan? What about the US? Do they offer humanitarian services? No, they have a very good platform where they just help the citizenry and they get all they want. But here in Africa, we are still under the ambit of colonialism and pre-colonialism. I must tell you one thing, Africa cannot liberate itself to government visionary leaders who will truly liberate Africa. Africa is a country with a vast natural resources, not just in terms of material resources, but human capital resources. And you see, the colonial masters are always all out to exploit these resources at the detriment of our own people. Most democratically elected governments are not really willing to look into the way forward for our own people. Instead, they imbibe policies, they abide policies are for the interests of the West. Um, it's so appalling. Most times, I wonder the kind of brains we have. No wonder the whites always, when they came, they saw us as savages, les sauvages, les damnés de la terre. The Frenchman with the wretched, the wretched of the earth. The Frenchman will call it. But within ourselves, we know we are very hardworking people. We know we are people of an absolute talent, not just talent, but we have resources. Look at the Congo. With all the resources that Congo has, it's one of the poorest countries in Africa, thanks to the French people. You look at countries like Niger with its uranium deposit. The French people has a primary right to agree before pacts are actually made between Niger and other countries of the world. When I'm talking about bipolar leadership of the world or a hegemonious world, we're not just talking about America. Because most times when we talk about hegemonious world, you think na ị na-ekwu maka ndị America. Ọ bụrụ ndị America na-eme ihe niile. It's not the Americans that are doing every other thing. They are doing this through an alliance between other countries of the world. Um, this has basically been aimed at Africa to keep Africa perpetually subjugated to the whims and caprices of the West. Now, one may ask, what's happening with Africa? Because the West has the press, they have the technical know-how. They use these against our very own people, and then they refine our head. They want to spin your head and then make you believe that what doesn't really matters. But in their own countries, most times they ignore what's very important. Look at England, for instance. The Queen of England has been in England for how many years? The kingship system, or call it the parliamentary system of England. Do you know that the Queen of England can actually veto what the parliament have said, and then nobody talks about it? Nobody wants to talk about it. But in Africa, when someone makes holistic decisions, even if they are in the interest of the people, it's painted as the monkey, which the West sees Africa to be. I don't want to care if you really accept what my point of views, but they are very personal point of view, and I believe in it, and I know they are real. been able to go through. I've been opportune to be across French West Africa. At least I've been to Senegal, I've been to Togo, I've been to Benin Republic. I grew up in Cameroon. I understand to an extent the impact of the French on French West Africa. This is not the way forward for Africa. And then I see what ECOWAS is doing. ECOWAS are not acting alone. They are acting in an alliance with their European masters. Most African leaders, especially those in ECOWAS and other parts of an African Union, are not acting alone. You look at a country like Algeria, you look at some countries like Burkina Faso, where the military have actually taken over. And then you will understand that there is a need to do away with the French system, the pre-colonial system. That is the economic control of Africa in its entirety. Africa as a people need to wake up. The time and era has gone where you have to depend on a people. You have the right to actually go into a pact of your own. If they grant you political independence without economic independence, then you are not truly liberated. You are still under the control of your colonial masters. No wonder the French calls it the Pact for the Continuation of Colonialism. And that is one of the reasons the military junta in Niger Republic have decided to take over the government, at least for the true liberation of Africa. What's the role of other African nations? Look at Nigeria. I was surprised. I was so much surprised at a situation where the Nigerian government took sides with the West in its quest to, with other ECOMOG countries, to do a military invasion into Niger Republic to seek for a return to democracy. Throughout the period that democracy was in Niger Republic, I challenge you to tell me, or I challenge anyone to tell me the true democratic nature of Niger Republic. A country that cannot provide its own railway had to rely on Nigeria in the government of Muhammadu Buhari to build a railway station from Katsina State to Niger. Is that the true nature of what we want in Africa? It's shocking. Our people are blinded by a lot of facts that revolves around the happenings in French West Africa and the Central African Union, the CEMAC. And this is one thing I really want to look into in this live broadcast. Be patient enough to listen, you will be able to understand what we're talking about. Now, I'll tell you one thing. The French government, the French people thinks that Africans owe them for all the developmental inquiries they had within the region during colonialism. But in the real sense, the French people owes us, and Europe in general owns Africa. They owe Africa not just for the exploitation of the natural resources and the sap in human brains, which they embarked on in the period of 1900. That was during the period of slavery. The Europeans came in down into Africa and they exploited us in terms of human resources and they exploited us in terms of natural resources. The dehumanization. Talk about the economic impact on Africa. If you look at the book written by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, you will be able to understand this. The problem I have with a lot of Africans is that we tend not to read. And when we read, we don't understand the impact of colonialism on Africa. And yet France believes that Africans should pay them, that we, the African people, the Cameroonians, the Malians, the Nigerians, the Ivorians, and the people from Togo should pay them for what they did in Africa. And that's why the French West Africans and the French Africans and the Francophonies and the French unions continually and continuously hold Africa perpetually into bondage. I will shock you. Do you know that the French Africans have the right to enter into military agreement with countries across the world is actually in the equation? Every country in French West Africa and the Central African Republic that was colonized by the French people have to toe the line of the French government at each given case. Now, if France has an issue with, per se, Russia, they are expectant that every African country must toe the same line. And then we all crave for the impact of the French and all the rest. That means even if it's not in tandem with what our own people down here want, you must toe the same line because the French people are taking that line. Is that not colonialism? Do you also know that in all French African countries, especially in CEMAC and Basel region, that is West Africa and Central African Republic, that at each given time, if the interests of the people of France are not protected, basically, it's a crime. Do you also know that French companies in West and Central Africa do not pay taxes? French companies in West and Central Africa do not pay taxes to the government of their domain because they must protect the French interest first, basically. You might not understand the enormity of this. Now I tell you that in the exploitation of natural resources across those countries, the French companies are given primary priorities. If there is a competition between an American company and a French company, per se in Niger, in the exploitation of uranium, French companies will take precedent. They will be considered first. That is an uneven trade. And no wonder if you compare the countries colonized by the French and countries colonized by UK or England, you see that there is a huge gap between them. You look at Ghana, Ghana uses the cedis. You look at Nigeria, Nigeria uses Naira. Cameroon and 14 other African countries uses the franc CFA, ensured by the French government and the French central bank. France no longer uses the France the CFA. They instead use the euro. But their own government down there in France controls virtually every aspect of the economy of the 14 African countries that uses the franc CFA. What does this mean? You do not have right to a foreign reserve. All you do is 80 to 85% of your foreign reserve is deposited at the French or the France National Central Bank, and then the insurance on your currency is insured by France itself. This doesn't go well. What does this mean? What it means is that you do not have rights to your own personal policies as an economic policy as a country. The economic policies of Niger, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso, Senegal, and others are formulated in France. Yes, I know this might be shock. It might be a shock to you, but the economic policies of all the Francophone countries are actually formulated in France. And then when they want to take a loan from the bank, it must be approved by the French government and it can be vetoed. And this is subject to the government of France, the present government of France, being in agreement with the economic policies of those governments in the state seeking for such loans. Little wonder why an old Hague like Paul Biya is still the president of Cameroon and the French government is against it, but they were against the persistence or the existence of the government in of the government of Laurent Gbagbo during the, you remember the Laurent Gbagbo and Ouattara crisis? They took sides because the government that was they fought against in Cote d'Ivoire favored indigenization of so many policies. So they wanted a stooge who will go after the wanting of the French government and then continue the perpetuation of the French policy of the continuation of colonization in French Africa. The French people and the Americans or the allied nations were also in favor of the dethronement of a man who had the interest of his own people at heart in the person of Muammar Gaddafi. They threw Libya into a serious crisis. Nobody is talking about it. Talk about humanity, they talk about humanitarian actions in Africa and all the rest. It's always a means, it was always a trap, it was always a means of exploitation of the African nation in their unipolar system. These people are not working separately, they are not working separately, they are working as a unified force. They use the United Nations, they use the International Monetary Funds and whatsoever you can call it, and they try to control the affairs of Africa. And then they come to you seeking or making you think that they are here for your own basic interest. They are here in Africa for their own personal interest. If you must know, Africa is a land with almost call it 35% of the natural resources or natural reserves in the world. This is the richest continent in the world, and then look at it. Its citizens are very impoverished. Now I've been to countries like Burkina Faso, I've been to Cameroon. You see the mega development infrastructures in those countries. And yet, these countries are very rich in natural resources. Now, let me talk about Niger. You see, Niger was created out of an artificial boundary, just like most other African countries. Its government has not actually impacted on the lives of its people. And the military took over. The French government, in fear of losing its assets in Niger, has actually imposed bans and sanctions on the people of Niger. And the African people at the ECOWAS are joining in, and they are trying to declare they are postulating war. Why haven't America, NATO, and other foreign allies gone into war to help Ukraine? Ukraine was actually brought out. I made this. In fact, they were made this a scapegoat in the war between the West and Russia. Russia is a very big threat, and if you look at the trend, Russia with its Wagner group are already in Niger, threatening the whole of ECOWAS. You know why? Because the leaders of ECOWAS are not using their head. Instead, what they're doing is that they are listening to the West, even against these own people. I'm most surprised by the actions of Ahmed Bola Tinubu, the government, the president of Nigeria, because he does not understand history, and then I feel he doesn't understand what's happening across the boundaries. Niger, as you know it, shares economic and political and cultural ties with the people of northern Nigeria. The people of northern Nigeria are made up of, especially the far north, are made up of the Kanuris, the Hausas, the Fulanis, and a hodgepodge of all the other ethnic nationalities. Same comprises Niger. The major ethnic group in Niger is or are the Hausa, Fulani, and the Kanuri people. The rest are relatively minority ethnic groups. And then the Nigerian government knows that in Niger, between Niger borders and the Nigerian borders, there are minor, in fact, there exist no boundaries. Because if there were boundaries within these borders, a lot of Nigerians that are here in Nigeria, even down here where I live, because I speak French, a lot of them think I'm maybe a Cameroonian or an Ivorian, but they are more open to me. You cannot go, Nigeria cannot afford to go into war with Niger. Nigeria cannot afford to go into war with Niger. You know why? There will be casualties across borders. And then you look at the Wagner Group, is a Russian military emissaries. They are already in Niger. The US and other people, they all have military bases in Niger. You go to Dakar, you go to Senegal, you go to Cameroon. You see the French and their whole military uh, apparatus stationed there. African movement, the French defense movement in Africa, the French days in Africa. What you're telling us is that Africa cannot defend itself. Most European countries, as you see them, are they truly democratic? Even if democracy was your own means, trace back your own history of evolution. Most European countries were ruled by hegemonious leaders. Must you force Africa to accept everything you say just for the exploitation of the natural resources? We're talking about Europe compensating Africa for the crimes they committed during the period of slavery. Nobody's talking about it. But people prefer to talk about what Muammar Gaddafi, who was even a true revolutionary in Africa, did in Libya. Free education, free healthcare. What? The first human-made dam in Africa was also there. But you prefer to winch hunt Africans and then try to control Africa. Anyways, going back to Niger, I will tell you that I, Okori Madwabuchi, I am against the use of military actions against the Nigerian government. Vehemently, I'm against it. If we must treat the Nigerian people as our own fellow human beings, then we must use sanctions. The Europeans, in their tackling of what's happening or what happened in what's it called, the Russian crisis with Ukraine, they did not go. The Europeans and NATO forces did not go into full-blown war with Russia. You know why? Because they know that Russia is also a highly developed nation, militarily and otherwise. So if you go into a full-blown war with Russia, this might spiral into the second or the third world war though. So they were very careful in handling the affairs of the Ukraine war with Russia. Then why can't the foolish leaders we have in ECOWAS, the stupid people we have there in ECOWAS, why can't they not think? Yes, Nigeria has already cut off electricity supply, and then Niger has been suspended from the economic policies of France. But must an independent country, the so-called, in quotation mark, independent country called Niger, rely on France or rely in the economic policies of France to sustain its own economy? The French people have for so long exploited the Francophone Africans. And what we as a people must fight is not just for political liberation of Africa. Now, the junta in Niger has declared a 3 years transition period for its own people. Why not be patient? You've already imposed economic sanctions. You've already closed the borders. Yes, those are policy. Those are principles of conflict resolution. When I'm talking about international relations, it's is a policy. But going into war with the people of Niger, you must be aware that casualties will arise across borders. Niger has boundary with Algeria, has boundaries with Nigeria, has boundaries with, I think, Togo or Benin. If you go into full-blown war, one, you're going to lose military personnel. The government of Muhammadu Buhari must understand that we have a large chunk of insurgency in Nigeria. The IPOB people are here in the southeast. Though I don't believe IPOB are unleashing mayhem, but the unknown gunmen though are unleashing mayhem in the southeast. The headsmen are there in the north. Boko Haram, you haven't handled it. And then you're going to liberate some other people when you've not actually liberated yourself. I like America per se, not because of their foreign policies across Africa, but because of their policies in defense of their own people. They think of their own people first, America first. They will always say. The French people, out of their own moral decadence, talks about le plus grand France. When they talk about the le plus grand France, it's basically the exploitation of Africa. Someone might say, yes, I have a very wide ideology because I'm in support of the military takeover of so many African countries, because the military, when you see them, they are very decisive. They don't care. Because the civilian government we always have across Africa are always weaklings. They are chicken-hearted. Yes, quote me, they are chicken-hearted. The continuous exploitation of the African continent is of utmost concern, and everybody must look into it. A continent with huge mineral resources, being the least developed continent in the world, are you not ashamed of yourself? People, be ashamed of ourselves, Africans. How come that in our economic policy, in the French African countries, we are busy putting France first at the detriment of our own people? It's a shame. And you see African countries posing about, boasting. We are going into for a military incursion into Niger. We are going to Guinea. We will kill them. Igbo Hako, Baniefenu. Muhammadu Buhari or Ahmed Bola Tinubu, have you been able to tackle unemployment in Nigeria? Yes, I know your foreign employees who are pushing this button. They will give you money. But you must tackle the problems in Nigeria first, primarily. Nigerians first. Leave others to handle their problem. Your own role is, as a big brother in Africa, is to advocate for a peaceful resolution and a peaceful transition into a more democratic and a decisive government. But have you been decisive in your own country? No. And you are busy fighting for some other countries or for the liberation of other countries. Now, if you look at the period where Abacha and the case of Ken Saro-Wiwa, you know what the West did. Because they also believed, some of them believed that Nigeria was an independent country. So what they did was the imposition of sanctions. And you know what the outcome was? Abacha had to, even if intentionally did not plan to leave power, but he thought about a transition to democratic government, and he was thinking about his own retirement and him emerging as a presidential candidate across countries. Now is the turn of Niger. You want to show that you have power. What power do you have? You've not destroyed the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria, the herdsmen crisis. You've not the series and avalanche of kidnapping that is ongoing in Nigeria. You've not tackled it. Now you're going to fight other countries' problem. You've not finished. Someone is having a headache. He's not treated his headache. He's going to help someone else treat theirs. Think about Nigeria first. And African leaders should think about the interest of Africa first. Personally, I do not even see what the military across Africa, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and currently you have Niger. I do not see. These are measures that must be taken, and somebody must take the bull by the horn and truly liberate Africa. French Africa has suffered a lot because in most cases you see them work so hard to please France. Okay, look at the French football national team, and you see what's happening there. Majority of the players in the you look at Kante, you look at Benzema, you look at all the things, other people. There are very few. The France team that won the World Cup are solely or majorly made up of people or players from the African origin. Africans must think deeply We must be intentional in our economic policies with Europe and across the world. If you do not do this, if you fight war with Niger, your own brother, Nigeria, for instance, Niger, you're going to fight war with Niger. Niger is your close door neighbors. Economically, they are highly reliant on Nigeria for their import and export and some other boundary nations. And you're going to fight war with them. What about your economic interest in Niger? If Nigeria played this role right, Niger, even at the declaration of this coup, will be highly reliant on Nigeria instead of going for the Russian groups, the Wagner group, to come help defend them. But you've played the faux part, and then you've gone to declare war. The Nigerian military junta is now in favor of the Russians. Think well. Thank you.